The conference hall in Paris glowed with cold light. French flags lined the walls, and the air was thick with tension. Cameras clicked like distant thunder as Emmanuel Macron adjusted his tie and stared across the table at Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The young Burkinabe leader sat in silence, calm, composed, unreadable. President Traoré, Macron began, his voice laced with diplomatic arrogance. Let me be clear. France has invested billions in the Sahel. Our troops, our companies, our influence, they keep stability. France will not leave. The room fell quiet. Every journalist turned toward Traoré. The African leader slowly leaned forward, his dark eyes meeting Macron's. You say France brings stability, he said softly, but I see only graves, African graves dug for your interests. A murmur rippled through the audience. Macron's jaw tightened. You forget, he snapped, Burkina Faso is still part of the Francophone community. Our presence protects you from extremists. Traoré's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Protect us, he repeated. From whom? The extremists you armed, or the hunger your corporations created? A few French reporters gasped. Macron raised his hand sharply, signaling silence. You're playing a dangerous game, Captain, he warned. France won't leave. We built the foundation of your institutions. Traoré stood slowly, his military uniform shimmering under the lights. You built them, he said, his tone cutting through the silence, but you built them on sand, and sand always buries what stands too long. The crowd froze. The tension in the room thickened like smoke. Cameras flashed again. Macron leaned forward, voice trembling slightly. So, that's your threat? Traoré looked him straight in the eye. No, he said calmly. That's your future. Outside, protesters had already begun to gather. Africans living in France, waving both Burkinabe and Pan-African flags. The chants grew louder, echoing through the marble corridors of power. Africa is free. France will fall. As Macron turned toward his advisors, his face was pale. He'd felt something new, not defiance, but inevitability. Traoré wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso. He was speaking for every African nation still chained to France's shadow. And for the first time, France felt small. Back in Ouagadougou, the reaction to Macron's declaration was explosive. The moment the televised summit ended, the streets filled with people waving flags, chanting in unison. No more France. No more chains. From the balcony of the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré watched the swelling crowds below. The chants echoed across the capital like thunder rolling through a valley. His advisor, Colonel Sidi, approached quietly. Mr. President, he said cautiously, Macron's words are spreading fast. Paris has ordered reinforcements at its remaining bases in Niger and Chad. They're preparing for something. Traoré didn't move. They always prepare, he said, voice low. They've prepared for centuries, prepared to take, prepared to control, prepared to claim what was never theirs. Sidi hesitated. What if they move against us directly? You've humiliated him in front of the world. Traoré turned, his eyes burning with quiet certainty. Then we'll remind France that humiliation is nothing compared to hunger. We've suffered both, but now we've learned to feed ourselves. That night, he called an emergency cabinet meeting. Around the long mahogany table, ministers whispered about sanctions, trade cutoffs, and the possibility of covert sabotage. Energy Minister Diallo slammed his fist on the table. Let them cut their deals. Let them starve us if they must. We'll survive off our own land. Traoré nodded. Exactly. France controls gold, uranium, and cotton, on paper, but the soil still answers to us. If they tighten their grip, we take back what's ours, every ounce of gold, every grain of wheat, every drop of oil. The room erupted in applause. For the first time, Burkina Faso wasn't speaking of resistance. It was planning victory. As the ministers left, Traoré lingered by the window, watching the torches in the streets flicker like stars. He whispered to himself, they think Africa can't rise without permission. But we were rising long before they learned to crawl. Far away, in the Élysée Palace, Macron stared at the TV replay of Traoré's words, fists clenched. He's spreading revolt across the continent, he said bitterly to his defense minister. If we don't stop him now, France will lose all of Africa. The minister glanced nervously. And what if we already have, sir? 3 days later, dawn broke red over the Sahel. The French tricolor still flew over the last base outside Ouagadougou, Camp Dory, but its shadow grew smaller every morning. French officers inside the base read Traoré's latest decree with disbelief. Effective immediately, all foreign military operations in Burkina Faso are terminated. Any presence beyond this day is a violation of national sovereignty. Colonel Lefebvre slammed his hand on the table. He's gone insane. He can't order us out, we're the stabilizing force here. A young Burkinabe lieutenant, formerly trained in France, looked at him sharply. No, Colonel, you're the reason there's no stability left. The silence that followed was heavier than the desert heat. Outside, protesters surrounded the base gates, chanting Traoré's name. Banners waved in the wind. France out, Africa rises. In the palace, Traoré received a secure call from Niamey. It was General Tiani of Niger. Captain, he said, his voice low but resolute, you've started something larger than Burkina Faso. Mali, Niger, we're with you. France's time is ending. Traoré smiled faintly. Then let's make sure the world hears it. Within hours, 3 flags, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, were raised side by side in a symbolic declaration of unity. The image spread across social media like wildfire. In Paris, Macron's advisors flooded his office, their faces pale. Mr. President, the African Union is debating a motion to recognize the Sahel Alliance as a sovereign economic bloc. If this passes, France loses access to nearly 60% of its African mining operations. Macron slammed his desk. Then stop it, cut their funding, freeze their assets. But the world had changed. China offered new contracts. Russia proposed military cooperation. Even Latin American leaders sent messages of support to Traoré. That night, Macron gave a private order, activate Operation Minuit. If Traoré won't bend, we'll break him. In Ouagadougou, the same night, a coded message reached Traoré's intelligence chief. French operatives moving. Sabotage expected within 48 hours. Traoré folded his hands calmly. Let them come, he said. Let them see what happens when an empire fights the fire it started. He turned toward the window, the Burkinabe flag fluttered in the wind, and beneath it, the words of the people echoed like prophecy. If France won't leave, then France will fall. Paris hummed with urgency. The Élysées war room smelled of coffee and old paper as Macron's top aides drafted a plan that would be swift, quiet, and decisive. Operation Minuit, a low-profile campaign of economic pressure, cyber disruptions, and covert influence, was signed off by sunrise. We'll make him regret this, one minister said, tapping a tablet. We'll make the markets scream, and his friends will turn on him. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré had already moved. He'd expected the predictable playbook, freezes, whispered threats, private meetings with pliant leaders. He had studied it for years. They mistake speed for inevitability, he told Marie as staff from every ministry took positions in an ad hoc command center. They forget the terrain they try to master, our land, our people, our networks. Their tools won't break what they don't own. The first night of Operation Minuit looked like a chessboard in motion. European banks flagged Burkina Faso accounts. Shipping lines delayed containers bound for West Africa. Anonymous emails seeded rumors of unrest. Social feeds in French and English echoed with alarm. Headlines asked if Traoré's gamble had finally gone too far. Traoré watched the feed with an almost academic calm. Predictable, he said. They squeeze. We adapt. Under his direction, the government executed contingency protocols that had been quietly prepared for months. Food cooperatives shifted supply routes, regional partners opened emergency credit lines, and local industries ramped production. The Burkinabe Central Bank moved to reroute reserves through allied nations. None of it was flashy, it was meticulous, boring, and resilient. On the ground, the effect was immediate and visceral. Markets still bustled. Farmers took radio calls from cooperative hubs to redirect grain shipments. In dusty courtyards, mechanics repaired old trucks to haul goods around embargoed ports. Citizens, primed by weeks of Traoré's messaging, lined up at new community-run distribution centers, not in panic but in purpose. The narrative Macron hoped would fracture the population instead hardened it. Meanwhile, clandestine wings of Operation Minuit tried subtler tactics. Cyber teams probed government servers with phishing campaigns, shadowy operatives sought to bribe minor officials, a rumor campaign aimed to depict Traoré as reckless and isolated. One covert team even tried to arrange a discreet meeting with a prominent mining magnate, offering lucrative contracts in exchange for public statements against the president. That move backfired spectacularly. The magnate, surprisingly, refused on principle. A leaked recording of the exchange later found its way to independent journalists: the offer, the bribe, the gall. The tape spread like wildfire. Those who had expected to be bought now watched a different drama, a continent refusing to be traded. Back in Paris, anger turned inward. Advisors argued, fingers pointed. "We underestimated him," an aide admitted. "He's not only surviving, he's making the counterattack look inevitable." Macron paced, stunned by how quickly the supposed leverage had flipped. For the first time, his calm veneer showed a hairline crack. In the months that followed, Operation Minuit kept trying new measures, but each move revealed a predictable weakness. The West's instruments depended on systems that a rising Africa could, increasingly, bypass. Traoré's strategy wasn't to crush France or to humiliate Macron, it was to show that dependency was a choice, and choices could be unmade. At dusk, as helicopters traced pale contrails over the city, Traoré stepped onto the roof of his office. Below, groups of neighbors worked side by side, sharing engines, water, and plans. He looked at the lights of Ouagadougou and whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, "They came with thunder. We answered with weather." The thunder hadn't ended, Operation Minuit continued, but the ground beneath it was no longer predictable. The story had changed. This was not a shrinking fight, it was a remaking. "Would you like me to continue with?" Paris had always moved to the rhythm of control, smooth, orchestrated, predictable. But that rhythm was breaking. Every time Macron spoke about stability, protests erupted in African cities. Every time he threatened, another nation cut its ties to France. The illusion of power was dissolving faster than any sanction could stop. In the underground newsroom of Le Peuple Libre, French journalists whispered the unthinkable: what if Traoré is right? Leaked documents from Operation Minuit had begun to circulate, revealing France's attempts to sabotage African economies. The revelation sparked outrage, not just in Africa, but in France itself. Thousands of French citizens flooded social media demanding answers. "We're not colonizers anymore," one protester shouted in Paris. "Why are we still acting like it?" Police sirens echoed as Macron's approval ratings plunged. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré sat with his generals. Maps of the Sahel stretched across the table, red lines showing French bases, blue lines showing Allied African positions. "Their strategy is fear," he said. "But fear only works when people believe they're weak." Colonel Sidi nodded. "The people don't believe that anymore, sir. They believe in you." Traoré shook his head. "No, they believe in themselves. That's the difference." He stepped outside to the balcony where thousands had gathered again, holding candles and flags. When he raised his hand, the chant stopped. "Africa does not hate France," he said, his voice carrying through the crowd. "We hate the arrogance that refuses to let us breathe. We will not destroy, we will build. But we will build without permission." The crowd roared, a sea of unity glowing under torchlight. Reporters captured the moment and streamed it worldwide. The images showed no anger, no war, only a continent reclaiming its dignity. Back in Paris, Macron watched the broadcast in silence. His reflection in the dark glass of the Élysée window seemed older, smaller. He turned defiance into a movement, one aide whispered. "And now even history is on his side." Macron didn't respond. Outside, the Eiffel Tower lights flickered, as if mocking the empire that once claimed to enlighten the world. Traoré, miles away, looked up at the same night sky, and for the first time, Africa's light felt brighter. Weeks passed, but the fire didn't fade. Across Africa, murals of Traoré appeared overnight, in Dakar, Bamako, Niamey, painted by artists who had never met but shared the same heartbeat, freedom. France tried to call it propaganda. The world called it awakening. In Paris, Macron faced his cabinet, his tone exhausted. "We are losing influence," said the foreign minister. "Even francophone countries are shifting east." Macron rubbed his temples. "Then we remind them who built their roads, their schools." A young diplomat interrupted softly, "And they will remind you who paid for it in blood." Silence filled the room. The truth could no longer be hidden behind treaties and televised smiles. The illusion of benevolent power had collapsed. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré walked through a dusty village that once depended on French aid. Now it had solar grids, local farming cooperatives, and young engineers teaching children how to code. This, he told the cameras following him, is independence, not in flags, but in food, in minds, in hands. His words reached Paris like thunder rolling across the ocean. French analysts debated whether Traoré had become the new face of post-colonial resistance or the man who ended France's century-old grip. Either way, he had shifted history. That night, he met privately with his advisers. "France will not forgive this humiliation," one warned. "They may try again, not with bullets, but with whispers." Traoré nodded slowly. "Let them whisper," he said. "Empires always whisper before they fall." In the dark, Ouagadougou's skyline glowed brighter than ever, not from foreign lights, but from African power returning home. A month later, under the blazing sun of Niamey, the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger gathered on an open-air stage. There were no foreign flags, no Western translators, only African voices echoing across the desert. The cameras rolled as Ibrahim Traoré took the microphone. "My brothers," he began, "they called us fragile. They called us poor. But poverty is not the absence of wealth, it's the theft of it. And today, we are taking it back." The crowd roared. Soldiers, farmers, students, and elders raised their fists in unison. It was not a summit. It was a declaration. The Sahel Alliance was officially born that day, a regional union designed to replace French-backed structures with African-led cooperation. Shared defense. Shared markets. Shared purpose. It was the blueprint of liberation written in real time. In Paris, Macron watched the live feed on mute. His advisers pleaded for a new strategy. "Maybe diplomacy," one suggested timidly. "Perhaps we." Macron cut him off. "We built those countries. And now they unite against us?" His voice cracked with disbelief more than anger. "It's not the end of Africa," he said bitterly. "It's the end of France's reflection in it." That night, while the French government scrambled for answers, Traoré walked through the celebration crowd in Niamey with no guards, no motorcade. Young people surrounded him, chanting his name, handing him homemade flags stitched with the colors of freedom. An old man touched his shoulder. "You've done what our fathers dreamed," he said, eyes glistening. Traoré smiled humbly. "No," he replied, "I've only reminded Africa that the dream was never dead." The drums rose, the chants grew louder, and in that moment, the sound of unity drowned out a century of silence. The French embassy in Ouagadougou had become an island of silence. Its gates, once symbols of power, now stood behind barricades guarded by uneasy soldiers. Every morning, protesters arrived, waving flags, singing, leaving flowers with notes that read, "Africa is free." Inside, Ambassador Delacroix sent another urgent cable to Paris. "Public sentiment has turned completely. Even former allies refuse to speak with us. Traoré's influence is total. In the Élysée Palace, Macron read the report in silence. His advisers argued behind him, some urging withdrawal, others insisting on retaliation. Finally, Macron rose and said, "History will not say France was chased away by a soldier." But history already had. The next day, Traoré held a press conference. The air was heavy, the cameras countless. "France says it won't leave," he began, voice calm but sharp. "Then it will be escorted out." Gasps filled the room. "Our sovereignty," he continued, "is not negotiable, not for gold, not for oil, and not for pride." Within 72 hours, the French embassy staff began their withdrawal. Convoys rolled through quiet streets under the watch of Burkinabe soldiers. No violence, no humiliation, just the cold dignity of a nation reclaiming its space. As the last truck left the capital, children ran alongside waving their red, green, and gold flags. One small boy shouted, "Goodbye, France," and the crowd laughed, not with hatred, but relief. That night, Traoré stood at the same balcony where he once promised independence. Below him, the people sang freedom songs until dawn. France warned they'd never leave, he murmured, eyes on the horizon. And yet the sun rises without them. The empire hadn't fallen with an explosion. It had faded with a quiet truth: Africa no longer needed permission to stand. In Paris, the morning newspapers carried the headlines Macron had feared most. "France withdraws, Africa turns the page." The front pages showed images of Traoré standing tall as French convoys departed. Commentators called it the symbolic end of Francafrique. Macron's silence in that moment spoke louder than any speech. His ministers avoided his gaze, his once loyal press now questioned his leadership. How, one anchor asked, did France lose Africa not through war, but through words? Across the continent, the energy shifted. African youths who once looked to Europe for opportunity now spoke of building homegrown futures. Universities named scholarship programs after Traoré. Activists in Senegal, Congo, and Chad adopted his speeches as manifestos. But not everyone celebrated. Western analysts warned of rising nationalism, anti-globalist sentiment, and the threat of instability. To them, independence was a crisis. To Africans, it was healing. In Ouagadougou, Traoré addressed a nighttime rally under glowing lanterns. "They said we'd fail without them," he told the crowd. "But failure only exists when you stop trying. And Africa has just begun." The applause was thunderous, shaking the ground. Among the thousands, a group of elders began to sing an old independence song, one that had not been heard since the 1960s. Young people joined in, blending generations into one united voice. Traoré stood motionless, letting the sound wash over him. "Empires fall when the people remember who they are," he whispered to himself. At that exact hour, the lights of the French embassy finally went out. Not from power cuts, but because there was no one left to turn them on. The silence that followed wasn't defeat. It was freedom breathing. The morning after the final French convoy crossed the border, Ouagadougou awoke to an unfamiliar peace. No flags of foreign nations. No distant orders. Only the rhythm of life, markets opening, children running, drums echoing softly through the streets. On the balcony of the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré looked out over his capital. His advisor approached quietly. "Mr. President," he said, "the whole world is watching." Traoré smiled faintly. "Then let them see what freedom looks like." He turned to the cameras waiting for his speech, a broadcast that would be remembered for decades. "To the people of Africa," he began, "today we close a chapter written in foreign ink. We are no longer shadows of empires. We are authors of our own destiny." He paused, letting the silence grow powerful. "France warned it would never leave," he continued. "But the soil remembers its children. And this land belongs to Africans, not in name, but in truth. From Dakar to Kinshasa, radios crackled and televisions flickered as millions listened. Some wept. Some cheered. But all understood, the tide had turned. In Paris, Macron sat alone in his office, the sound of Traoré's speech faintly echoing from a television screen. He reached for the remote, then stopped. For the first time, he realized, history was no longer being written in Paris. It was being written in Ouagadougou. That night, fireworks burst across the Burkinabe sky. Villages celebrated until dawn, drummers keeping time with chants of "Africa Rise." Traoré stood beneath the stars, his hands clasped behind his back. "Empires fall," he whispered, "but nations awaken." And as the first light of morning touched the horizon, it felt as if the entire continent was waking with him, free, defiant, and finally unafraid.